Chers amis, chers collègues, chers membres de la Fondation Barbier-Mueller, on est arrivé ce soir au 27e rendez-vous de notre conseil de fondation d'abord. Je vais présenter ce que nous faisons. Pas tout le monde est au courant et il nous importe que une grande partie, la plus grande partie joignable des personnes intéressées soit informée. Nous sommes donc une fondation constituée en 1998 par Jean-Paul et Monique Barbier-Mueller avec le but de répandre, de divulguer la culture italienne de la Renaissance et en particulier de la poésie italienne de la Renaissance. Ce qui veut dire aussi poésie, par exemple, en latin ou dans d'autres langues que l'Italie connaît. Par exemple, l'Italie est très riche de dialectes. Et les dialectes sont souvent une des langues de la poésie. Donc cette fondation a ce but. Elle promue la culture italienne, comme j'ai dit, de la Renaissance, et nous finance, à travers la famille Barbier-Mueller, à travers Stéphane et Diane Barbier-Mueller, nous permet d'avoir une revue qui s'appelle Italique, qui est née en même temps pratiquement que la Fondation, 1997, qui est une revue de poésie italienne qui va de Pétrarque, disons de Dante, de Pétrarque jusqu'à Marino, XVIIe siècle, et qui sort avec une échéance d'un numéro par année. Et nous avons vu justement le dernier numéro qui est sorti il y a quelques semaines. Et ce sont des gros numéros de 450-500 pages. Nous avons eu la chance d'être reçus par les organismes internationaux qui évaluent les publications scientifiques dans notre domaine, donc les humanités. Et nous sommes bien placés, nous sommes au premier rang, ce qui nous félicite beaucoup, évidemment. Et ce qui nous porte et ce qui nous apporte des propositions toujours fréquentes d'articles, d'autres collaborations avec des universités de toute Europe. Et voilà. Donc, la Fondation elle-même se double d'un patrimoine absolument remarquable et je dirais unique d'anciens textes de recueils de poèmes, incunables, donc les poèmes qui ont été édités avant 1500, et Cinquecentine, livre du XVIe siècle, qui donc arrive jusqu'à la fin du XVIe siècle, et qui est en constante augmentation. Aujourd'hui, ce patrimoine est gardé sous le chapeau, disons, de l'Université de Genève. C'est un patrimoine de quelques 600 livres anciens. Nous avons, et nous cherchons à avoir tout ce qui est possible dans le domaine de la poésie italienne et latine aussi, ce qui rend cette fondation unique. Parce que bien sûr, nous avons des grandes bibliothèques, la Vatican, la British Library, la BNF à Paris, qui ont des fonds de poètes italiens, évidemment. Mais un fonds qui s'alimente que avec des éditions de poésie, ça n'existe pas. Donc, pour les chercheurs, et nous en recevons beaucoup pendant l'année, Pour les chercheurs, c'est un lieu de fréquentation absolument privilégié. Y accéder, évidemment, demande des règles que nous faisons respecter d'une manière très stricte, parce que le fond est de grande valeur, mais l'accès est relativement facile. Ce qui nous permet de recevoir non seulement les chercheurs qui viennent pour faire des recherches, mais aussi, toujours grâce à Diane et Stéphane Barbier-Mueller, nombreux boursiers qui viennent de toute Europe et qui passent leur temps, normalement quelques mois, à y travailler ici, à contact direct avec les livres. Donc c'est vraiment en valeur sûre, ajoutée, dont l'Université de Genève bénéficie. Et ça, c'est ce que je voulais dire. Je ne prends pas trop de temps parce que notre hôte, Virginia Cox, tiendra aujourd'hui cette conférence Italian Lyric in the Age of Global Renaissance. Virginia est une grande spécialiste non seulement de la littérature italienne, elle a fait énormément de publications des travaux, mais de cette tradition lyrique, poétique qu'elle a contribué d'une manière remarquable à renouveler. Et je dirais simplement qu'elle vient d'une expérience universitaire très large. Elle a étudié à Cambridge, au Trinity College de Cambridge. Elle a fait son doctorat avec Frank Woodhouse. Puis elle est passée à Édimbourg, correct? Édimbourg, pour quelques années. Puis elle a eu un poste d'absolu prestige aux États-Unis, à la New York University, pendant 18 ans. Et puis elle a été en Angleterre, elle a été en Italie, elle a été en France, elle a enseigné un peu partout. Mais surtout, elle a été redemandée à Cambridge, au Trinity College. Ils ont créé un poste exactement pour elle, un poste de très très et prestigieux niveau. Elle ne doit pas nécessairement enseigner, elle le fait si elle le désire, et comme elle aime bien l'enseignement, elle le fait, mais elle s'occupe plutôt surtout de recherche. Alors, je ne vous fais pas la bibliographie de Virginia, parce qu'on restera là pendant un quart d'heure au moins, mais je vous dirai les axes principaux de son travail. Alors, grande connaisseuse de la tradition rhétorique de l'Antiquité à la Renaissance et bien au-delà, elle dirige en ce moment 5 volumes qui vont apparaître chez Cambridge University Press en 2027. 5 volumes d'histoire de la rhétorique de l'époque ancienne jusqu'au XXe siècle. Ce sont divisés évidemment le travail, mais c'est une œuvre qui vous dit la grande maîtrise qu'elle a cet argument. Tout au début, elle a étudié, par exemple, des formes littéraires comme le dialogue. Le dialogue, c'est un instrument à la Renaissance, et pas seulement à la Renaissance, même médiévale, qui est véhicule de contenu, de discussion, de dialectique sur tous les thèmes, hein. Pas seulement littéraire, poétique, mais scientifique, mathématique. Il faut simplement penser à Galilée, je veux dire, et d'autres. Donc il y a ce deuxième thème qui s'installe au croisement de la rhétorique, bien évidemment. Et puis, il y a un intérêt pour la poésie lyrique. Elle a découvert, en particulier, Virginia Cox est la personne qui a relancé l'intérêt pour la poésie féminine à la Renaissance et bien avant. En 2008, elle a publié un livre qui a fait la une de toutes les revues et il a été discuté dans toutes les manières, en démontrant que les femmes qui écrivaient entre 1400 et 1550 étaient, ce qu'elle a repéré, elle, plus que 250. Donc cette idée que les femmes ne participent pas au monde littéraire n'est absolument pas exacte, et son travail, depuis cette œuvre qui est apparue à l'université de New York, hein, et qui a vraiment donné une dimension tout à fait nouvelle, a été suivi par un nombre de chercheurs comme ça. À l'intérieur de cet intérêt, elle a publié différentes femmes poétesses, les œuvres, et beaucoup d'autres choses. Une dernière, mais je suis certainement en défaut par rapport à tout ce qu'elle a fait, c'est un intérêt pour la culture et la civilisation de la Renaissance au sens large. Et alors, là, nous avons, par exemple, des livres très importants qui ont paru cette fois à l'Université de Johns Hopkins en 2011, 2025, et puis il y en a d'autres, mais je me borne à ces deux livres. Le premier de 2011 s'intitule « The Social World of Renaissance Lyric ». Vous comprenez que le monde de la lyrique éclate, en quelque sorte, avec des intérêts que nous entendrons ce soir aussi, sur des thèmes très différents. La géographie, l'économie, l'orientalisme, dont il sera en partie question ce soir, etc. Et ça en 2011. Et puis, en deuxième volume dans cette lignée, The Italian Renaissance, a Cultural History, Cambridge University Press, 2025. Donc, le regard que Virginia pose sur ce monde, qui est parfois très partagé, très limité, comme ça, est un regard à 360 degrés. Et ça nous plaît beaucoup, parce que nous n'oublions jamais, et ça c'est une conviction en moi que j'ai partagée avec Virginia même hier soir, en dînant ensemble, etc., que les disciplines que nous cultivons doivent se montrer curieuses et dialogantes avec les autres, pour le moins les humanités. Parce que sinon nous sommes perdants. Nous ne savons plus dialoguer avec les géographes, les historiens, les économistes, etc. Il faut que la discipline de l'italianisme récupère une dimension culturelle au sens large et pas seulement autosuffisante dans son travail que nous assurons le mieux que nous pouvons. Voilà, je pense que je termine ici. Je remercie infiniment Virginia Cox, auquel on a tenu tellement à avoir comme conférencière. Finalement, elle est là, de l'acceptation, d'avoir accepté notre invitation. Je la remercie au nom de la Fondation Barbier-Mueller et je lui donne certainement la parole. Merci encore, Virginia, de ta présence.
So, many thanks to Massimo for that very kind invitation. Many thanks to the Foundation for your very kind invitation to me to speak. I'm very happy to be speaking here today. Many thanks to you all for turning up to listen. And I'd like to apologize as well for my lazy choice to speak in my own language. I think we could consider it an act of kindness, since I really didn't want to inflict my horrible French on you. My talk today comes out of my current book project, which is on Italian lyric poetry in the later 16th century, with a special focus on the very late 16th century, the 1580s and 90s. This is one of the periods of Italian literature that's been historically the least researched and which remains relatively, well, I would say very largely unknown even today. There's up to this point only really one overview of this late period in the 16th century lyric tradition, a piece by Riccardo Bruscagli of 2007. It's a really excellent piece, but inevitably it's only a book chapter, so it's a kind of initial mapping of this period rather than a comprehensive study. So as Bruscagli points out, Italian lyric poetry in the late 16th century differed really quite significantly from the much more familiar Petrarchism of the earlier and mid Cinquecento. Two aspects that Bruscagli emphasizes are the intensely social and sociable nature of this poetry, which explains my working title for the book, which I'm showing you, and also the subject matter of this late Renaissance lyric, that this is the period when amorous lyric begins to be overtaken statistically by a much broader range of subject matters, some of which really have figured very little indeed in the earlier Petrarchan tradition. So I would see those changes as part of a broader shift towards an engagement of the lyric tradition at every level with the social and material world, the kind of real world. My contention in the book is that this very different kind of lyric requires a different methodology, and that's what I'm trying to work through in this book. So one distinctive feature of late 16th century Petrarchism is that you start seeing the subject matter of poetry, and particularly the variety of subject matter, emerging as a kind of independently recognized poetic quality. And you can see this already in a mid-century theoretical work like Girolamo Ruscelli's Del modo di comporre in rime, in versi of 1558. So as you can see, I've picked out the passages I want to call attention to. Ruscelli talks about the perfezione dei soggetti as an importantissima parte dell'invenzione of poetry. And he ventures even a mild criticism of Petrarch for his relative monotony on this score. He says that Petrarch attese quasi a correre di continuo un campo solo, sebben con qualche varietà. And he's talking obviously about the field of love poetry there. So he concludes by saying that poets today, in the mid-16th century, who want to extend their range should, instead of focusing solely on Petrarch, they should imitate modern figures such as Ariosto Bembo, Sanazzaro, Guidiccioni, and Molza. And I think this is an interesting and shrewd point because it does define a feature of 16th century Petrarchism that significantly differentiates it from Petrarch's own practice, at least in his selective Rerum Vulgarium Fragmenta. And I think this is something we're becoming increasingly aware of today with the work of scholars like Simone Albonico and Amelia Iuri, who've called attention to the content of early 16th century Petrarchism, so it's soggetto in Ruscelli's terms. So Ruscelli offers us a kind of snapshot of the Italian lyric tradition at a point in which the direction of evolution towards a greater variety of subject matter was already clear. And that trend continued and became ever more important and ever more marked as the century progressed. So by the time I'm looking at the period I'm focusing on, the 1580s and 1590s, around 40% of the lyrics in any given collection are what I call social poetry, which it's a kind of term I've coined in order to capture that whole range of poetry which is not about love and it's not about religious devotion. So it covers correspondence verse, encomiastic lyric, and also commentary on public matters of collective concern, most obviously poetry, but you also get a lot of lyrics on areas like crime and punishment, natural disasters, notable building projects and urbanistic projects. So practically anything that you might find in the period's emerging news culture as we encounter it in Chronicles and in Avisi, these early news sheets. So you get this strange convergence between lyric and news culture. That was one of the things that most fascinated me when I started working on this. So as I said, around 40% of lyrics in most collections are social, in my terms, and then the rest are divided between love poetry and religious poetry, which is also taking an ever-increasing market share at this time. That's true of collections by lay male poets. You also get poems by other demographic categories, such as women and male clerics, which increasingly in this period include no love lyric at all. And I see as a prototype for this Laura Battiferi's Primo Libro delle Opere Toscane of 1560, which is one of the first collections to feature this very distinctive conjunction of social lyric and religious lyric with no love poems whatsoever. And there are obvious reasons of decorum why a woman might make that choice. Male clerics also, after the Council of Trent, were increasingly under pressure to observe clerical decorum in their writings. So you get a similar pattern emerging with male clerics of this mixture of social verse, or rime morali, to use the favored term at the time, and religious verse. And this is one of the authors we'll be looking at today, Angelo Grillo, who is a Benedictine monk. He publishes this very interesting collection in 1589, which does also, as with Laura Battiferi's work, contain this kind of mixture of rime morali and rime spirituali. As some of you may know, Grillo found a kind of creative solution to the problem that clerics weren't allowed to write love poetry anymore. He actually wrote love poetry and published it under a pseudonym, Livio Celiano. That was not a very common choice, though, I have to say. So what all this means for the subject of my talk today is that by the time that Italy, or the Italian states, were entering into the most fascinating and intense moment of engagement with what's sometimes called the global Renaissance, in the late 16th and early 17th century, lyric poetry had by this point migrated into being an eminently flexible instrument for exploring just about any subject matter that it chose. As Massimo was saying, I'm a great enthusiast for rhetoric, and I like to compare it to the very expansive view of rhetoric that Quintilian presents in his Instituto Oratoria. Like rhetoric, lyric poetry was a genre or a mode of discourse that started with quite well-defined subject matter and that subsequently expanded to the extent that it could engage with almost literally any subject in the world. So before I go on, I need to explain a little bit about what I was meaning when I said, for Italy, I'm talking specifically, that Italy's great moment of engagement with the global Renaissance really came in the late, according to me, in the late 16th and early 17th century. Now, that's obviously not to say that Italy had not been present in this story of, I suppose I should define what I mean by global Renaissance. I'm just talking about the ever-intensifying patterns of exchange and interaction between different cultures, and particularly between cultures which had either not been in touch at all or had been relatively little in contact before the Renaissance. So, yeah, what do I mean when I say that it's in the late 16th and early 17th century that the climax of this moment happens for Italy? You do get, of course, involvement of Italy with this global Renaissance right from the time of Marco Polo and the Franciscan missions to Asia in the 13th and 14th centuries. And Venice and Rome in particular were obviously enormously important in the 16th century as kind of places of exchange of information about travel and ethnography. But I think it's really in this period that, well, it's certainly in this period that you see the most intense Italian influence phase of the Jesuit missions in Japan and in China. And you also, in the 1580s, get the launch of the initially wholly Italian-led mission in China. So I'm illustrating this with this rather fascinating portrait, which was identified recently, of one of the participants in the Tensho embassy, which was a Jesuit-led mission which brought 4 young Japanese converts to Europe and ultimately to Rome in a moment of quite extraordinary cultural resonance. And I'm also showing you, for the China mission, this famous portrait of Matteo Ricci in the guise of a Chinese literatus in a painting by a Japanese-trained Chinese-Portuguese artist. So you get the Jesuit missions, which are, of course, reported on very thoroughly and followed closely in Italy. And you also get in this same period something like the formation of the Medici Oriental Press, which was set up in the 1580s. Partly it sent envoys to Africa and to Asia. Initially, the real project was to collect manuscripts showing the early history of the Eastern churches, the early history of the Eastern Christian churches. But it also they also brought back manuscripts from other religious traditions. So here we see a manuscript brought back in the early 17th century to Florence by Giovanni Battista Vecchietti, who was one of the employees of the Medici Oriental Press. And it's a Persian Sufi classic by Rumi. So it has this double mission of importing early Christian material and also making available for the first time very important Persian manuscripts. And I suppose that would be the last development I wanted to point to in this period, that this is the period that really sees the launch of serious study of Persian language and literature in Italy. So I researched this period fairly thoroughly for the second edition of this book, which came out last year. I'd been asked by the publishers to add a chapter on Italy's relationship with the European and also the non-European world. And although I wasn't really focusing in this book very much on lyric poetry, because I was working on this simultaneously with the book on poetry that I was talking about earlier, I found that the two sort of converged quite interestingly. So that's where this talk is coming out of, the kind of convergence between these global interests and my work on later 16th century lyric. So in the rest of this talk, as a kind of very preliminary sample of how we might explore the intersection of Italian lyric poetry and the global Renaissance, I wanted to talk you through 3 concrete examples of poems which illustrate 3 different aspects of this topic. Now, inevitably, this is going to be a little bit impressionistic, but I'm hoping it will give some idea of how this area of research might be pursued. So first, to introduce my 3 authors, one is the Calabrian Florentine Giovanni Battista Vecchietti, who we just met in connection with this manuscript. My second figure, he is from a generation later, is the Roman Pietro della Valle. Both of these men were kind of fully paid up citizens of the global Renaissance. They were both very famous travelers, and they were both early protagonists of the study of Persian in particular. Their travels were mainly to Persia and to India, but Vecchietti also traveled to Egypt, and Della Valle also to the Ottoman Empire. Della Valle was an independent traveler, while Vecchietti traveled as a diplomat for the papacy and also, as we've seen, as a manuscript collector for the Medici Oriental Press. Both of them, as I say, Della Valle and Vecchietti, were pioneers in the study of Persian. Both of them also knew Arabic, and Della Valle also made a very serious study of Turkish. Both of them are mainly known for their prose writings, but both left bodies of verse. Della Valle's is found in his diaries, which were the source for the published letters of the 1650s and 60s. And there are also collections of verse by him in manuscript in the Biblioteca Estense in Modena and in the Vatican Library, the former of which has been published. I've given you the details here. Vecchietti is a very interesting case. He was known during his lifetime to have been quite a respected and significant poet. Gabriele Cabrera, for example, makes him the chief interlocutor of a dialogue on poetry. But mysteriously, until very recently, hardly any poems by him survived, just literally a handful, until, I think in 2023, that recently, a scholar called Lorenzo Amato discovered a significant manuscript of his verse in the Vatican containing a canzoniere of over 300 poems, which are only really just beginning to be explored. So our third author is someone we've come across already, the Genoese Benedictine monk poet Angelo Grillo. Grillo is a far more prominent figure in the history of poetry than either Della Valle or Vecchietti. He was famous at the time, and he's now once again recognized as one of the most significant figures in the lyric tradition between Tasso and Marino. But up to this point, it's really just his religious poetry that's been studied in any detail, and a work like this, which I showed you earlier, has been really curiously ignored. So Grillo, I think, is an interesting counterexample to Vecchietti and Pietro della Valle, who I was describing as being fully paid up citizens of the global Renaissance. These are the kind of people who global Renaissance historians work on. Grillo, as far as I know, never actually left Italy in his life, although he traveled a lot within Italy. He didn't even travel in Europe. And yet he's a good example of how even stay-at-home Italians in this period could have really quite significant and consistent relationships with the world of the global Renaissance. So Grillo seems to have developed a particular interest in Japanese culture, dating from the time, we get the story in this caption here, dating from the time when the abbot at his monastery just outside Mantua announced to him one day that the Tencho embassy were arriving on a visit the following day. And Grillo pulled off this extraordinary feat of writing a 190-line canzone overnight to greet them. We also have some fantastic letters from him from the early 17th century to a Japanese Christian friend of his called Pietro Antonio Araki, which show us Grillo's quite detailed interest in things like Japanese proverbs and the geography of China. Okay, on to our texts. I'm going to start by looking at a small sample of Della Valle's verse, and I should say that this section of my talk might need a trigger warning, un avviso di contenuto sensibile, because the subject matter is quite distressing. So it's a sequence of 3 poems from this Vatican manuscript, which can be dated to around 1623, when Della Valle was traveling in India. He describes a meeting with a young widow in her 30s called Yukama, who had decided to immolate herself on her husband's funeral pyre, to become a suti, in other words. She didn't come from the kind of elite background where this was a usual practice. Her husband had been a musician, he was a drummer, and so her choice was quite a distinctive and personal one. It wasn't kind of culturally constrained. Her husband had 2 other wives who had decided to remain firmly alive. Della Valle's conversation, which he reports in his diary with Yukama, or Giacama as he calls her, has been rightly hailed by John Paul Rubies and others as an exceptional instance of cross-cultural understanding from this period. Della Valle doesn't agree with Giacama's reasons for her self-immolation. He tries to talk her out of it, but he respects her resolve and he admires her fortitude and her determination to craft herself as a kind of moral exemplum. He says that she was happy to have met this traveller from a far distant land because her fame would thus spread to, far outside India. So the Vatican manuscript of Della Valle's verse contains 3 sonnets on Giacama, reflecting on her deed and its meaning. The quatrains of the second one, which is the one I want to focus on, explore the paradox that Giacama, as an infidel in Christian terms, lacked faith in the Christian God, and yet she showed herself as a paradigm of faith in her husband. So, o Giacama, se quanto a Dio infedele altrettanto al tuo sposo fossi stata, non ti saresti mai viva bruciata per serbare altrui fede a te crudele. O Giacama, se a Dio così fedele come al tuo sposo ti fossi mostrata, la vita ti saresti conservata, ma con perpetue lacrime e querele. So, in the tercets of the poem, Della Valle explores his own status as a grieving widower. He had lost his wife, a Syrian Christian, after a few years of marriage. And he contrasts the continuing quiet grief of a Christian widower prevented by his Christian faith from the remedy of suicide with the horrendous but swift remedy of suicide by fire. So he says he's just talked of how a Christian would have to continue through their widowhood with perpetue lacrime e querelle. Io così faccio, e a farlo mi insegna la santa legge che dal ciel discese, che solo al mondo d'osservarsi è degna. Vorrei seguir chi in paradiso ascese, ma per non far di ciò l'alma mia indegna, aspetto che mi chiami chi le prese. So one thing I find interesting about these poems within the Italian lyric tradition is that consciously or otherwise, Della Valle is revisiting here a motif found in widowhood verse by Veronica Gambara and Vittoria Colonna in the first half of the 16th century. Both of them wrote poems after the death of their husbands in which the widow poet refuses the temptation of an immediate end to her suffering through suicide and resolves instead to endure the protracted suffering of widowhood to ensure the chance of being reunited with her beloved in heaven. Colonna even has her kind of Giacomo or moral counter-type figure in the form of Brutus's Portia, who's a figure who, for various reasons, she identifies with strongly. So Portia, in her grief on hearing of Brutus's death, has the remedy as a pagan of seeking relief in suicide, while the Christian widow poet does not. So I'm showing you a stanza from a canzone by Colonna, comparing the widowed poet herself to various classical exemplars of marital faith, culminating in Portia. And Colonna says of Portia, I'm citing the highlighted passage, that parmi il tempo che costei si dolce quasi un breve sospir. She herself, by contrast, suffers a protracted agony of sorrow. E nel mio cor dolor vivo e mortale siede mai sempre. And she gives two reasons why she embraces this form of kind of living death, a fear of eternal damnation and the fear that she will lose the chance to be reunited with her beloved again. So I think this illustrates very well one of my key points in my cultural history book, which I showed you earlier, that Italy's long experience of humanism, of a fascinated engagement with the classical pagan world and classical belief systems, provided a template for Italians' engagement with modern pagan cultures, especially in Asia. It allowed a dual vision of these cultures as errant in religious terms because non-Christian, yet simultaneously admirable in all kinds of moral and intellectual ways. So I think someone like Della Valle could negotiate a complex, modern, transcultural and transreligious encounter such as that with Giacomo, precisely because he came from a culture long habituated to such encounters through its immersion in the Greco-Roman world. So let's move on now to our second example, which is from Vecchietti, around 2 decades earlier. This is a sonnet describing a visit to Shiraz in southern Iran, in modern terms, on his second trip to Persia in 1601. The poem is more self-explanatory than Della Valle's, so I'll just start by reading it. Per queste fresche e fortunate rive, che 1000 an verdi seggi ombrosi e lieti, di ninfe albergo, altrui fidi segreti del cor, lungo esse acque corrente e vive, coronate dalle sacre olive, cantando andar quei chiari almi poeti, dei quai ciascun dal ciel rotti divieti nell'altrui bocche e nei suoi scritti vive. E bever di quest'onde e in questo lido che per lo sacro è celebrato tanto come al ciel piacque ebber sepolcre nido. Famosi cigni di Smirne e di Manto e voi di Flora di sì chiaro grido, chiamate ancor questi serenieri al canto. So the poem starts with an idyllic description of the beauties of Shiraz, its flowing waters, its green riverbanks, before going on to recall the city's celebrated medieval poems, Sa'di and Hafiz. In the final tercet, the poet calls on Homer and Virgil and the great Cigni of Florence, Dante and Petrarch, to welcome Hafiz and Sa'di to their number. The passage recalls in concept, if not in verbal echoes, the passage from Canto 4 of Dante's Inferno, where the living Dante is inducted into the Bella Scuola of the classical poets in limbo. Here, the medieval Persian poets I miei gentilissimi poeti persiani, as Vecchietti describes them in a letter of 1619, are welcomed into the classical stroke vernacular Western tradition, again, as in the Dantean passage, making up a canon of 6 poets in total. This perceived fellowship breaking across pagan Christian boundaries is so extended in this way from the proximate otherness of the Greco-Roman past to the modern but paradoxically more distant otherness of Asian paganity. Incidentally, I've copied Lorenzo Amato's transcription of this poem here, but I do wonder whether the serenieri in the last line might be stranieri, which would be emphasizing, obviously, the otherness. I'm not sure what serenieri might mean. So one further detail I wanted to call your attention to in this poem. One of the most notable, salient rhetorical devices in Vecchietti's poem at the end of the first tercet is the hysteron, proteron, ebber sepulchrae nido. So these 2 poets had their death and birth, or their birth and death, in Shiraz. The use of the metonym of the tomb to allude to their death is, I would suggest, far from casual here. Shiraz, at that time, as still today, hosted prominent tombs for Sadi and Hafiz, which were places of poetic pilgrimage. Pietro della Valle, when he visited the city, speaks of the tombs as encrusted with written and inscribed poetic epitaphs for the poets. So it's like a kind of living, speaking, poetic tomb. Pietro della Valle himself contributed to this tradition. He wrote epitaphs in Tuscan and in Persian, though he didn't quite trust himself to post them up on the tomb. Della Valle speaks of Hafiz as the Persian Petrarch, and that detail reminds us that Petrarch's tomb at Arquin was a similar place of poetic pilgrimage, and a tradition of writing poetry after visiting the tomb at Arquin existed also in Italy. And Italy also had a rich tradition of affixing poems to tombs and to monuments. I've been coming across this all the time in my researches for the book. So I think that too would have enhanced the sense of cultural consonance for Italian visitors to Shiraz, like Vecchietti and Della Valle. So I think the revered poetic tomb acts here as a kind of cultural connector or vector in Vecchietti's sonnet, just as widowed grief and widow's fortitude does in Della Valle's Jacamà sonnets. In both cases, these express values that for an empathetic observer can bridge religious and cultural divides. And I think we could say the same for the first quatrain of Vecchietti's sonnet, which has this kind of lyrical, bucolic description of Shiraz in language very familiar from classical and vernacular pastoral poetry. I think in a way the first quatrain is anticipating the final tercet. It's placing these Persian poets within this tradition and seeing the kind of similarities that connect them. So, on to our third and final example, which is a very different one, both stylistically and in terms of its subject matter. This is a poem that appears in Grillo's second collection of secular verse, published in 1599 in Venice. It's written in Grillo's characteristic proto-Baroque, concetto-rich style, and it's not at all easy to understand. I'm going to start by reading it out, but please don't worry if you can't make any sense of it at all. So, di quella sacra tela in cui se stesso, con se stesso s'espresse il mio Signore, a se stesso pittore, stile e colore del posente re d'India al nobil messo, in breve angusta carta, or vivo espresso, ecco il pio volto, come l'hai nel core, d'astral suave di divino amore, novo avagaro e più fedele impresso. Opera è del mio Battista, a cui die il cielo con l'arte e il gran pennello, ond'egli degno di ritrar fosse il re superno in terra. Fabio, qualor con sì pietoso zelo, l'adori e inchini questa poca terra, d'essi sovenga e questo fango indegno. So what's this sonnet about? What's its subject matter? We're talking here about an artwork of some kind painted in breve angusta carta. It represents Christ, il mio Signore, il Re Superno in terra, and it's painted by Battista, and we can work out fairly easily from Grillo's other poems and his letters that it is Battista Castello, a Genoese painter, one of two painter brothers. The other is Bernardo, to whom Grillo was exceptionally close. The painting has been sent to a Fabio, and here the extremely terse captions of this volume are useful to us because they identify this as Fabio Biondi, who was a papal official who served in Lisbon as apostolic collector in the 1590s. So he's quite a global Renaissance figure. He was also a rare patriarch of Jerusalem who actually went to Jerusalem, and he had quite interesting contacts with the Congo as well during his time in Lisbon. So a little research in Grillo's letters shows us that Biondi stayed at Grillo's convent in Genoa before he set sail for Lisbon, and Grillo sent this gift icon on to him shortly afterwards. I say icon because this is a work that's clearly intended for domestic devotion, when in the final tercet we see Fabio kneeling before the icon in a spirit of pietoso zelo. Grillo asks that he recall the donor, i.e. himself, in his humble guise as fango indegno. And I think if we want to imagine the kind of object we're talking about here, it's useful to look at something like this. This is a portable altar designed by Battista Castello, and this was his kind of trademark production, these works designed for domestic devotion. So it remains to be seen what the painting is actually of, what the image represents. And that's where the first quatrain of the poem can help us. We learn that the painting sent to Fabio Biondi is a copy of another painting, a Sacra Tela, in which Christ expressed himself through himself, and he was his own painter, his own stylus, his own instrument and his own colour. So this is a contact relic, something like the Veronica or the Turin shroud. It's something impressed by Christ through miraculous means on a canvas. And within a Genoese context, that can only mean this image, the Mandilion or Sacro Volto of Genova, which was brought to Genoa from Byzantium in the 14th century and was held at the Armenian church there, where it still is. So in a legend recounted by Eusebius in his ecclesiastical history, and later elaborated on in a late 4th century Syriac text, this image was impressed by Christ on this cloth when a king of Edessa, Akbar, who was a contemporary of Christ and had heard of his miracles, sent a painter as a kind of envoy to him to capture his likeness. We're seeing the painter here in the middle of the image. And the painter, Anania, attempted to paint Christ, but was unable to capture his divine essence on canvas. So Christ mercifully wiped his face on this handkerchief on which his image remained, and that was returned to Edessa and became a sacred icon. So that helps us understand the line about the nobil messo of the potente re d'India. We're talking about Anania and Abgar here. And it also helps explain line 8, where Fabio, the recipient of the image, is described as a novo Abagare più fedele. He's the new Christian Abgar. He's receiving this same image in a copy of Christ. I hope you appreciate my attempt to mock up what the object actually sent to Fabio Biondi might have looked like. But it's not a real image. So yeah, what's going on in that second quatrain is that in addition to the two images we've learned about, these material images, the original Mandylion image and the copy that Grillo has commissioned from Battista Castello, there's also this third image, which is the image of Christ impressed on the heart of Fabio as a novo abogare più fedele, impressed by divine love. So it's a complex poem. It's got a great deal to say about the role of images within Catholic worship, and particularly within Catholic evangelization. The Christ-curious King Abgar could serve as a kind of prototype of precisely the kind of ruler who Catholic missionaries in this period wanted to attract to Christianity within non-colonial contexts. So Persia, Mughal, India, Japan, China. I'm showing here the Mughal Emperor Akbar in a distinctly westernized hybrid representation. The legend of Akbar, the ancient king, is a myth about faith in things unseen and the role of images and words in creating and sustaining that faith. The Portuguese Jesuit Jerome Xavier, whose image we saw earlier, who spent time at the Mughal court, wove the myth of Abgar brilliantly into the preface of his Life of Christ, the Mirror of Holiness, which he wrote and had illustrated in 1602 for Akbar, the Mughal emperor, which is obviously a near homonym for Abgar. This is why this works. So Jerome modestly compares himself to Abgar's painter. He says he's someone whose own human eloquence and skill is not enough to allow him to narrate or mirror Christ's holiness, but he hopes to do so through Christ's own direct inspiration, just as Christ painted himself in the image of Edessa. So Jerome hopes that Christ will impress himself directly on his words. And Grillo, I think, may have had similar hopes that his own words, and particularly his religious poetry, might contribute to global evangelization. There's a really intriguing passage in a letter from Grillo, probably dating to the late 1580s, to a Dalmatian Ragusan shipowner in Lisbon who's setting out for the Americas. It transpires from the letter that this man has offered to circulate Grillo's verse, including the Canzone dei Signori Giapponesi, the canzone for the 10-show embassy. He's promised to circulate these works in Mexico and other parts of that great world, l'altre parti di quel gran mondo. And it strikes me that this is another way in which one could approach the topic of the relationship of late Renaissance Italian lyric to the global Renaissance by looking at the evidence of the circulation of Italian verse outside Europe. There is some evidence. It's quite slight, but there is some, and people haven't really been looking for this up to this point. Okay, so those are our three examples, and I hope they will have illustrated for you the potential richness of a study of Italian lyric and the global Renaissance, particularly in this late Renaissance period. This is a fresh subject at the moment, though I suspect it won't be for long. a young colleague, contact of mine, Yaliang Fu, who's currently at Itati, is researching Latin and vernacular poetry written for the Tensho Embassy in Italy, of which he has found a remarkable quantity. And I'm sure also that the very recent discovery of Vecchietti's lyrics, which have a whole sequence on his visit to Persia, will also stimulate a great deal of new research. So there isn't all that much at present by way of theoretical infrastructure for the type of work I'm advocating. But a short essay by the Yale scholar Aisha Ramachandran, published in the second edition of the Blackwell Companion to the Global Renaissance, published in 2021, can offer some useful pointers, I think. Ramachandran coins the term lyric thinking, and she highlights as the essence of this lyric thinking lyric poetry's embrace of a particular epistemological position, that of the first person, the situated, the subjective, the phenomenological. And she argues that lyric is thus particularly well equipped to express, quote, individual experiences of living in a world recognized as global. And I think her point is good, that a lot of the genres of writing on which global history has tended to rely as sources, such as travel writing and ethnography, tend to be descriptive and cartographical in character, so objective rather than subjective. So lyric can add this important kind of novelty to the range of sources we look at. So, quoting her again, attending to lyric can help us to explore the question of how globalization was experienced, absorbed, metabolized, understood. And I would add to that, felt. This was a period, the late 16th century, which placed affect self-consciously at the heart of poetic and artistic production. Grillo, who's in a quiet way, a kind of theorist of poetry as well as a poet, entitled his religious lyrics Pietosi affetti, and he's highly attentive to the role of affect in his secular verse as well. So I think we can see examples of lyric thinking and lyric feeling in all the three examples we've looked at. In the case of Vecchietti and Della Valle, I talked about the way in which these poems seek cultural and affective connectors or vectors between the foreign reality that's being described and the author's own lived, originally European experience. Grillo's sonnet provides the reader who's prepared to enter into its complexities with a launching pad for a sustained reflection on the capacity of images and words to throw bridges across distances, temporal, geographic, and religion, so that I think the sonnet serves as a kind of meditation object, not dissimilar from the artwork, the religious artwork that it's describing, this traveling icon. So even just looking at these three fragmenta, as Petrarch might call them, we can begin to get a sense of how attending to lyric might enrich and deepen our understanding of the global Renaissance, and also to see how the expansion of lyric subject matter that we witness in the late 16th century enabled lyric poetry to act as interpreter for the experience of inhabiting an expanded and expanding world. That's it.
Thank you, Virginia, for this wonderful conference, for the complexity of your surveys, and for this interest between Europe and Italy and Renaissance of Italy and other cultures. It was a very pleasure to follow your speech, and I think we have in the salle a lot of persons who are interesting on the topic, on the poetry, of course, but on the cultural difference with Asia and other. And I think at the moment we have 30 minutes for a discussion, and who will take la parola?
Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. It happens to be that I'm finishing these days a French edition of Pietro della Valle's letters from Persia, from Shiraz, and in the second of these letters, he tells the story of the death of his wife Mani, and a little later he goes to visit the tomb of Hafiz and Sadi, as you mentioned, and there's an interesting thing about the visit of Hafiz's tomb, because Della Valle is he has sort of an ambivalent relationship to not to Hafiz but to the context, because on the one side he has admiration for the poet, for the figure of the poet, and on the other side he's not very at ease with the fact that so many people come to visit the tomb as a gesture of devotion and almost religious devotion. And he uses, I don't have unfortunately, I don't have the Italian text here with me, but I have the French translation. And he says, that's about the tomb. Néanmoins, tout l'édifice n'a été bâti que pour honorer le sépulcre du poète, et les Mahométans nomment ce lieu ziyara, c'est-à-dire visite, comme s'il voulait dire qu'il mérite d'être visité par dévotion, comme un lieu saint. Et ces fous aveuglés le vénèrent en cette qualité. So here clearly there is a distance taken by Della Valle towards this kind of excessive devotion. And then he says that he, as you mentioned, he writes verses, but not only in India, also when he visits Hafiz's tomb. And he says this: l'amour que j'ai pour les poètes me suggéra 4 vers en forme d'épitaphe que je dictai en notre langue sur son tombeau, faisant allusion aux épigrammes de sa façon. So he's imitating the poetical forms used by Hafiz. And then he says, je ne voulus pas néanmoins permettre qu'ils y fussent écrits. I didn't want these poems to be written as epitaphs on the tomb, de peur que les Mahométans n'en prissent occasion de se glorifier qu'un chrétien avait rendu cet honneur au tombeau d'un infidèle. It's very funny because there is that ambivalence. I fully agree with you when you say that because the Italian Renaissance is used to admire pagan poets, it gives the Italian author the ability to go towards religious frontiers and so on. But still, there is still something which resists to a kind of easy and normal relationship to these figures.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a question or just a remark.
That's certainly true. I don't know if you know that piece by Christelle Baskins.
Yeah, I know it. Yeah, it's excellent.
Because I think she kind of weaves together the whole story of Della Valle's kind of, commemoration of his wife and his visit to Shiraz and the tomb culture there and so on. I think it's a fascinating and extraordinarily rich thing. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because, I didn't want to sort of give the impression that I'm thinking that there's no kind of Christian resistance to these cultures within any of these writers, because clearly there is, and that passage in Della Valle makes that very clear. But I suppose I see the trajectory of this work as following the pattern a little bit of people getting almost overexcited about Jesuit accommodation and the kind of cross-cultural interests of people like Matteo Ricci and so on. And then I feel there was something of a backlash against that when people would say, yes, but these people are still Christians and they're still missionaries and so on. And I would like to sort of, I suppose my thought of introducing that notion of discrete cultural connectors or vectors was a way to try to get away from that, because you can have someone like Della Valle, he's very clear in that sonnet we looked at that she's wrong and he's right, and if only she'd been able to embrace the faith and so on. And yet there are clearly things about her moral choices which he also feels to be admirable. So I feel we could maybe escape those kind of polarizations by thinking in different terms. Also, I do kind of feel with Della Valle that despite his extraordinarily flamboyant kind of Orientalism in many ways, I don't think he seems to truly engage with these cultures as much as Vecchietti does. That's my sense. And I sort of feel that Vecchietti is really very interested in, you know, maybe using Neoplatonism and the similarities with Sufism to find some actual kind of spiritual bridge between these cultures. But having said that, I have to say I'm by no means an expert on this, but I'm very glad to hear that you're translating Della Valle into French.
Thank you, Dr. Cox. That was fascinating. I'm totally out of the domain. This is the first time I'm encountering a topic like this. It's really very, very fascinating. I've always perceived from my angle, I come from an Asian background, educated in Asia, and I've noticed that there's been a lot of Eurocentrism in the education systems that we encounter in Europe and also in the global north. One question I would have for you is, do we have any evidence of reciprocal channels of influence, Italian to the Persian or the Asian context? We see that there has been this sort of transfer from Hafiz, the great Persian poets in Asia. Is there any evidence of the reciprocal channels?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, certainly in this period, you get contexts such as the Mughal court, where there is we saw that image of Akbar, you know, painted by painters who had clearly absorbed a great deal of Western style and also Christian iconography and so on. So you do get those kind of cases, and I think actually it would be very worth looking at these very rich sources such as the documentation for Vecchietti and also Della Valle's diaries and so on, and to look closely specifically at their descriptions of conversations with the people that they met in Persia and in India, and I think you might be able to pull out of that the kind of people they were talking to and the sort of questions that they were being asked by those people. And yeah, it is a really interesting topic. I mean, it's a curious field in that there has been a lot of work on all these figures and on most of their writings, but it's also true that we have every excuse for Vecchietti since his poetry only emerged very recently, but not much has been done on Pietro della Valle's poetry, for example. And I have a feeling that if we look at some of the other sources which have been treated as slightly peripheral, we might be able to get a little closer to those kind of conversations. But also, obviously, we need a lot more scholars who are capable of working across Persian and Arabic and the various European languages, and there are some, obviously, but we need a lot more of that kind of work. I'm really getting the feeling that now Chinese and Japanese scholars are coming more into this field of global Renaissance studies as well. We'll get very interesting input from them, since they can read a whole range of sources that most Europeans working on this can't.
Très belle découverte à travers les 3 exemples que vous avez donnés. Est-ce que vous accepteriez un parallèle du point de vue de l'ouverture culturelle entre le voyage de Marco Polo d'un côté et le divan de Goethe de l'autre, avec la même admiration là pour Goethe pour Hafez?
Yes, certainly. I mean, they're all part
Ce
of
sera un chaînon
the
manquant
same.
entre les
Yeah,
deux
they're all
pôles.
part of the same story. But
No, of
I
course.
suppose what I think about the material that I was looking at today is, I hope it's okay if I reply in English. Or meglio italiano? Ah.
Si, en français, oui, ou anglais, pas de problème, en anglais.
Yeah, I think it's certainly true that these are part of a long tradition, and you would want a much kind of more longue durée kind of study of it. But I do think it's true that for very kind of specific reasons, this period in Italian literary culture and lyric culture has been very, very much neglected. So I suppose it's the fact that there's a lot of lyric that hasn't been read at all that is coming from this precise moment when you're getting all these very interesting cultural contexts that I wanted to point to. But certainly, yes, I would love to see it folded into that much longer tradition.
Thank you very much. I have a question on the Vecchietti sonnet. If I'm right, I understand that the meaning is to enlarge the canon of the poets, or not. I wanted to be sure to have understood the sense of the last part of the Vecchietti sonnet, when he says, these poets bever di quest'onde e in questo lido, famosi cigni, chiamate ancora questi stranieri al canto, and your readings is totally, for me, convincing. Stranieri al canto is to say, this last part is to say, to imagine a sort of global chorus of poets. Am I right, or I have not rightly understood?
I think it really is, and there are other things in Vecchietti's writings that bear that out. Like, I first came across Giambattista, the famous Vecchietti, when I was working on a manuscript I discovered by his brother, which was an epic on the conquest of Mexico. Not a very good epic, I must say. So I started reading around these people. I was fairly convinced it was written in the late 1580s. So I read all the records of the Accademia degli Alterati in Florence, of which he was a member. And when he came back from his first voyage to Persia, he gave an improvised lecture. He was called on to just like speak about and he spoke on the similarities between the Persian language and Latin and Tuscan, and he was clearly using that kind of linguistic argument to build on the idea that these were in some sense the same tradition. And he also describes Persian as the language most ideally suited to poetry. And obviously for a Florentine or a half Florentine, since Tuscan was clearly the most ideal language for poetry in Italy, I think he is trying to make these very close kind of conjunctions. He's also got another sonnet to Shiraz, a rather lovely sonnet, when he maps it onto Florence, and he says he feels as though he's back in Florence. I think he's literally kind of folding these poets into the Western tradition.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it. Oh, yes. I was wondering, since you have worked a lot on the genre of dialogue, I was curious about your thoughts, or whether you could contrast the the destiny of poetry in this global context, and what happens to the genre of dialogue, which maybe can incorporate more than the sonnet literary traditions or philosophical traditions that are, I don't know, observed outside Europe. I don't know if I'm clear with my question.
Yeah, that would be another thing that would be very interesting to look at. I mean, I'm thinking of things like the way in which a genre such as the collection of axioms almost immediately formed a kind of bridge, like when I mentioned Grillo's letters to his Japanese friend Pietro Antonio Araki. He was asking, he clearly was a great fan of like commissioning artworks to distribute among his friends. And he was commissioning manuscripts with lists of Japanese proverbs with the translation in Latin, I think it was, and with them written in Japanese script as well as in European script. And it made me think immediately of the fact that Matteo Ricci in China wrote his first book in Chinese on friendship as a collection of axioms. And he was clearly doing that because this was something within the Western philosophical tradition that he could also see operating within the philosophical circles of his Chinese friends and so on. So I think looking at genre as a way of, as a kind of focus for analysing cross-cultural interactions could actually be very, very profitable. I know people in drama are looking a bit about the intersections, particularly in Japan, between the kind of Jesuit mission drama and the incredibly rich Japanese theatrical culture that was growing up kind of at the same time and in the same context and so on. So, yes.
Alors, s'il y a dernière question, s'il y a quelqu'un qui veut prendre la parole. Sinon, je pense que nous avons eu une discussion fourrée. Je remercie beaucoup Virginia Cox pour cette magnifique conférence qui ouvre sur des panoramas qu'on n'a jamais, pour le moment, à la Fondation, cultivés. Donc, c'est un thème qui est bienvenu, nous fait plaisir d'entendre et surtout qui ouvre des panoramas comme nous n'avons besoin, pas seulement en ce moment, mais en général. Donc je remercie beaucoup la Fondation Barbier-Mueller, Diane et Stéphane Barbier-Mueller qui nous font l'honneur et le plaisir d'être présents. Je remercie énormément Virginia Cox pour sa conférence vraiment terrifique. Et je vous remercie tous d'avoir été présents. Et à la prochaine fois, sous la présidence de Frédéric Tinguely. Merci beaucoup.